All right. Moving on to our first presentation of old business, we have the continued presentation of the Austin Police Department audit by an APD Racial Inequities and Institutional Racism report by Joyce James and her consultants. Ms. James, thank you for being online. I see that your colleagues are with you as well, Mr. Bauman and Ms. Hill. So I believe what we wanted to do, if you wouldn't mind, I know you sent us a quick overview presentation. We actually have, let's see, I've got about a little bit more than 30 minutes for you. So we've got the presentation that you sent, and then we just wanted to look over those highlights and then open it up to questions since we didn't have questions last time. Does that work?
That works.
Wonderful. So if we can pull up the presentation, and if you can just take us through the overview and highlights, that'd be great.
It would be the other one.
Sorry. Yeah, there you go. That's it.
Okay. Yes. And we have quite a few slides, but we had no intention of going through all of those.
Yes.
Just to, again, frame the presentation around the request coming from the City of Austin's Office of Equity back in March to engage with us in doing a comprehensive review of multiple other reports that had been done on by Tatum, use of force, police profile, and a couple other reports that we were looking at to try to bring it all into one place so that it would be easier for the Equity Office and APD to work from a comprehensive report. What I'd like to just say is that consistently across the board in the report findings and in the interviews and surveys that we did, there was consistency in terms of what people shared and what was found in the report. So if we could go on to the next slide. So someone else is advancing those, right? Okay. So we're going to share with you just some brief overviews, the quick wins that we recommended that APD could start to do now, and then some longer term strategies that we were asked to provide to the Office of Equity and APD. And one other thing that we'll share with you is APD's response to the intensive groundwater analysis workshop we did on racism with the chief and assistant chiefs and some folks and officers even from the community. So we can go to the next slide. This is just our mission, and why we were engaged is because I had developed a model when I worked at the state level that had been effective in reducing racial inequities. We can go to the next slide. The framework that I used previously and that we use in our consulting work with other systems and institutions is the same one that we're using with APD. Okay, next slide. And the components will come up later. We'll have something under each of those, so we don't have to go through those right now. We can go to the next slide. The next one. Okay. So the first report that we actually reviewed was the Tatum report. And what we found is that as we reviewed the findings in the Tatum report, and as we did interviews with both civilian and sworn staff within APD and people within the community, we found that all of these things really came together to kind of report allegations of internal negative issues at APD, both in the areas of race, gender, and sexual orientation. There was a sense from interviewees regarding the handling of the report. Many people knew about the report, but they were somewhat concerned that no specific action had been taken to remediate the problems that were in the report. The survey data also indicated that African Americans were less satisfied with the workplace climate related to things like promotions, complaints, fairness, more so than our Hispanic, Latino, and whites. And women were more dissatisfied than men along all of these survey dimensions. Okay, we can go to the next page. This is one of the surveys that we did where we gathered information from internal, sworn, and civilian. And I want Dr. Bauman to just briefly speak to the results of that survey.
Thank you. Can you all hear me?
Yes, yes.
Oh, okay. The pattern you're wanting to look at on the right with the bar graphs is the blue pattern relative to the green and the red pattern. The blue pattern are African Americans, the red and the green, white and Hispanic. And as you can see on every dimension there, which I'll just let you read, African Americans feel less strongly about things like how much racism is tolerated, how the organization treats women, and so forth and so on. And you can sort of read them over, but basically what you got is a difference between the African Americans and the Hispanics and the Anglos.
And so this is compared to some of the things that were in the Tatum report, and then when you look at the survey, it confirms those same findings, as did the interviews that we did with staff as well as with community.
And Ms. James, these are your own survey that you did in addition to the previous reports.
Absolutely. We developed the survey, we administered it. The responses came back through My90 to us. It was confidential, and we had approximately 1,000 APD sworn and civilian staff. So it's pretty valid in terms of its findings. And again, there's that pattern of Hispanics and whites being more closely related in their responses to the organization and how it handles issues of race and ethnicity, and there being some fair to significant differences in the response of African Americans.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, the next slide is the review of police racial profiling. We not only looked at APD data, but we also did some national comparisons. And so national and local data both indicate a higher percentage of African Americans and Latinos were stopped, cited, arrested, and searched than whites. And nationally, although this hasn't been studied this way in APD, what we see nationally is that when people are stopped at night, that race is less of a factor in terms of who is stopped. And so that speaks to questions related to racial profiling, in that it's less when it's night driving. We can go on to the next graph, and you will see that Dr. Baumann will speak to these briefly, but they pretty much confirm what we saw at the last meeting. I think the Office of Police Oversight showed some very, very similar data, and we're finding that all of the reports pretty much say the same thing. But Dr. Baumann can speak briefly to this.
All this is, it's really the same analysis. The data we had was up through 2018, and this is an example of what all the data show. And you can see on the far left the difference between the whites, and on the far right, the African Americans and the Hispanics next to that there's a great deal of disparity across the board, whether you're talking about stops, warnings, citations, or arrests. The differences are largest in regard to arrests. The next slide, if you put that up, just shows the data over time. And the only important point to make here is you'll notice that things seem to be getting worse, at least from 2015 to 2018, which as far as we had, I don't know if the 2020 data that the staff showed last week included this, but it's interesting to note that both for Hispanics and African Americans, the at least stops seem to be worse.
Yeah.
Yes, and what that says to us is that over time, even though these reports have been done on a regular basis, that the interventions that have been put in place have not addressed, have not reduced the profile and the racial inequities that we see. Okay, so next slide is looking at police profiling. In our interviews and the survey data, which we asked questions as it related to attitudes towards race, gender, and sexual orientation, all of that came together to paint a pretty consistent picture of the institutional culture at APD. And what it speaks to is that there was a lack of accountability at the leadership level in responding to repeated complaints about racism, gender, and sexual orientation. And what I want to say here is, based on the many, many years of experience that I've had doing work with systems to work to undo racism is really what it's about, is that when we speak to the lack of leadership, it's not necessarily the same as speaking to leadership in general, because most leaders have not been trained to lead work to undo racism. And so I just really want to speak to that there's a difference between general leadership and leading systems to undo racism. And that's where we see the lack of accountability in responding to repeated complaints about racism. Is that there needs to be a lot of work done to develop the capacity of the leadership to focus in on this type of work, because there is no discipline that requires its members to have an analysis or an understanding of institutional and structural racism. And so we don't come from our institutions of higher learned and trained, nor required to have that. And so the survey data on attitudes towards race also indicated that African Americans are in less agreement that APD does not tolerate racism, institutional and structural racism, non-discriminatory practices, and their ability to raise questions and provide solutions along these lines. And so we have a graph on the next page that shows the response to the questions on the survey as it relates to attitudes towards race. Dr. Bauman?
Yeah, and the pattern to notice here is that the blue line, the African Americans, are always less than, except one exception that I'll point out in a minute, are less than Hispanics and whites. The third one I think is interesting in the sense that the question asked is, employees in my organization believe that institutional and structural racism exists. This is the one exception. Look at Afro-Americans relative to Hispanics and Anglos. They believe it exists more so than do the others.
Right, and so there's just, it's a pretty similar pattern again in that African Americans tend to have a greater level of disagreement as it relates to the culture and its response and tolerance to addressing race and racism.
I have a quick question on the two things that seem in conflict to me are the one that says that institutional racism actually exists. So the third question, and then on the bottom it says, I understand how systemic institutional racism affect the organization's operations. So that seems interesting to me that only 28% or 28% believe that it exists, yet 60% say that they understand how it operates within the organization. So that seems counterintuitive to me. Mm-hmm. Does it exist or does it not exist? And then how does it, if it doesn't exist, how exactly do you know that it affects your operations? So that's interesting to me. Do you have any insight on those two questions? Those really stuck out to me as something I wanted to dig into a little, if we have a minute.
No, I actually don't. And it's interesting you pointed that out. I hadn't noticed that, but it is a contradiction in a sense. I'd have to think about it a little bit, but that I think it's clear to me that African Americans do say they believe that institutional and structural racism exists. How it affects the organization, they seem less, less certain about it, as do Hispanics.
Right.
Yeah. It's interesting that they're about the same from African American and more so in Hispanic, but it's about the same 40 to 44% in believing it exists and understanding how it works. That just seemed interesting to me. So
yeah, and it could be that now I don't want to speculate here, but it could be that the response to the question, employees in my organization believe that it exists, were smaller numbers for whites and Hispanics. And then understanding how systemic and institutional racism affect the organization could be in the vein that it's not as prevalent,
Yep.
right? So it could be that it's really not affecting. Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Okay. Great. Thank you.
We could go. Sure. We go to the next slide. We're looking at the Villanueva training. No, we're at use of force. I'm sorry. We're at use of force. So the data clearly showed that force and force severity is disproportionately used on African Americans. And one of the interesting things for us is even when other neighborhood demographic characteristics. And so what we mean by that is that in neighborhoods where poverty and crime has been considered as a factor, that race is the stronger predictor when all of the factors are the same. And we see that not only in use of force, but I mean, we see it in all areas like, you know, discipline in public schools and whose children get removed by child welfare and, you know, all of who's more likely to go to juvenile lockup. That in the very same or similar situations, that race will be the most prevalent predictor of the response from the system. And that's what we found here in terms of use of force. And so even when we look at national data on police shootings show that African American men and women and Latino men and Latina women are far more likely to be killed than white men and women. And, you know, so interviewees were suggesting more consistent use of body cameras and training that focuses on examining those attitudes and assumptions that lead to officers being afraid in some communities more so than others, that we certainly believe has a strong impact on arrests and even shootings based on that belief that their lives are in more danger. And the survey also indicated that most respondents are aware of the police reports that are contained in these documents, including profiling and the use of force. So it was really no surprise, the data as it relates to what people knew. Some of the disappointment, as we mentioned earlier, was the lack of attention to these areas. Okay, next slide. Okay, and so this is really about the reports and who knew about them and all of those different sections. Don, you want to just briefly speak to the survey questions on this part?
Yeah, I think there's one interesting one to point out. I think that everybody pretty much knows about the reports. Sometimes African Americans a little bit more, sometimes whites a little bit more. But the last question is the one that caught my eye. It says, my organization is committed to reducing racial profiling of Blacks and Hispanics, that is Latinos. And you'll note that both African Americans and Hispanics feel that they're less, that the organization is less committed than do Anglos.
Okay, and that's just a reiteration of what was on the previous page, is to show that we got that information by collecting the responses from the surveys and doing interviews. Okay, next slide. Okay, and this is the Villanueva training report. And of course, the weaknesses that were found in the curriculum, the paramilitary format and less attention to different learning styles and community policing were found to lead to greater attrition. And this was a consistent theme, both in the review of the report as well as in the interviews that we did. And so some of the suggestions that came out of that were more diverse recruiting, greater discussion on the criteria for when people are rejected as it relates to credit, financial status, those kinds of things. And what we found was that interviews, along with the need for resolving complaints by recruits, that people thought there should be better mental health and trauma training, improved recruitment of more officers of color and women, that there needed to be more diversity of the instructors and the materials presented, and more information on institutional and structural racism in order to create a better career path and for staff retention. Okay, next slide. Next slide. You won't go? Okay. So this is some of the information as it relates to community policing by race and ethnicity, and the responses about the organization working fairly, and how it impacts the lives of all people. And again, you can see that African Americans were less likely to feel like APD was fairly impacting the lives of all people that they served. And they were less likely to feel like the organization worked well with the community and sought their input on matters that affected their lives. And so that's pretty standard, and it is consistent with the surveys from the community as well. So we can go to the next slide. I'm going to try to quickly move us forward because we have, so these are some of the quick wins that we came up with. We thought that this report, being very comprehensive, including recommendations, could be used by APD to improve communication, which was another area that was cited as being pretty weak, was the way that information was communicated, and to use the report as a vehicle for opening the lines of communication, acknowledging mistakes, making the commitment to lead the work of creating an anti-racist institutional culture, and that this was something that could have been done immediately and used on an ongoing basis. We also felt like we could have set up a plan to provide the workshop to the recruiters and training officers in advance of the next cadet class. And that was based on the very, very positive response that the chief and assistant chiefs and some of the other commanders and officers and community people had to the workshop that we did. In that space, we had people with hundreds of years of experience who indicated that this was the best workshop they had ever attended. They had a much clearer understanding and analysis of what we meant when we were talking about racism, such that they could open themselves up to some new thinking and a new lens and a new understanding. And so we talked about collaborating with communications to share and discuss the report with the community and to get their feedback on the recommended strategies. Okay, next slide. Other quick wins was to begin planning for specific community engagement initiatives. That was some discussion that also came out with the chief and assistant chiefs, that to rebuild the relationships with communities, that perhaps we could pick one of the sectors, do some real community engagement in that sector, including bringing community in to do training with APD officers. We talked about incorporating those strategies that they were working on with TPOA into this framework so that it would not be a separate piece of work, but that it would all operate under one framework. Also, in the importance of engaging and utilizing the voices of the community members who participated in the workshop with the chief and assistant chief, so that their ideas did not get lost. They would be able to be an ally to APD in rebuilding the trust of the community, which they committed to do openly in those sessions. Okay.
Great. So I believe this is the top 7 of your quick wins. Is that correct?
Yes.
So can we take a moment right here and pause? I would love to talk to Chief Gay. And my first question is, there was 7 quick wins that were recommended to APD based on this report. And can you let us know where you are on those? And then I'd love to open it up to other questions from the commissioners.
Absolutely. Thank you, Commissioner Weber. We have been in meetings with the Equity Office. Of course, some of these things require us to actually have another contract that we need to move forth and work on that scope. I have already reached out to both Equity Office and Ms. James in doing groundwater analysis for our training division. So hopefully that can occur prior to the next academy class. So several of these things we agree with. It's just going to take us time to go ahead and work to develop our equity action plan, which we're working with the Equity Office to do currently.
Do you have a timeline for those? Just the moving forward of getting these things on the calendar with equity and with Ms. James. Do you have any idea what the timeline is for contract and moving forward?
That right now, of course, we have to go to council. So we're at least eight weeks out from that point. So I would say probably 2 to 3 months to potentially having a contract. We are looking at our current spending authority on what we can do outside of a contract to get some of these things moving forward sooner than later.
Because it seemed to me that there was some things on there that are fully in the control of APD about using the report, the communications, keeping the community involved. I don't believe that would necessarily be necessitated by a contract or Ms. James's organization leading that charge.
Correct. We've met with the Equity Office this week, the chief and I, as well as our equity manager that we've appointed to sort of help lead some of our equity efforts here in the department. We are currently working on an equity action plan with the Equity Office to include a training plan. We anticipate that within the next 3 to 6 weeks is that we'll have at least a framework of a good roadmap moving forward, and then we'll start our implementation of that roadmap.
Great. Commissioners, any other questions? Let's go with Commissioner Hobson-Clark first.
I don't have a specific question. I just kind of have a comment, and I don't know if anybody else kind of is thinking the same thing as me, but, just thinking about, the postponement of the cadet class and then the recommendations and then the moving forward with, different recommendations to do improvements. And I feel like we've kind of gotten a little bit stuck in this whirlpool of, we wanted a cadet class, but we need changes to happen. We can't get the changes to happen. We have timelines, and then I just struggle with. I appreciate Chief Gay giving us kind of a timeline on some of the weeks, but I guess just generally I struggle with how little progress I feel like we're making towards getting there.
Yeah, understood.
Are you?
She was just speaking on appreciating that timeline. I don't think there was a specific question to you, Chief.
No, I didn't have a specific question. I just, I think back to when we first started this conversation, and now we're looking at, a year ago or longer than a year ago. And I just feel kind of stuck. That was it generally.
And I second and reflect your feelings, Commissioner Hobson. So Commissioner Ramirez, do you have a question?
I think it was along the same lines. Just I can't remember what the timeline was for wanting to get the next cadet class going. It seems crazy to not make these changes before the next cadet class. And so it just seems like there needs to be more urgency. I feel like we've heard from so many different stakeholders and so many different reports that have been created and that have been generated in the past year that all say the exact same thing. And it needs to start. It needs to get kickstarted. And I don't know, I'm hearing that we're 8 weeks from showing something to council. And that just doesn't reflect the urgency of the situation. If in fact the needing new cadets is as urgent as it seems to be.
Can I add something real quick?
Of course.
I just want to make sure that everyone knows that we have been working on a timeline. I do know that the city management should be releasing our progress of what we have been doing over the last year. Dr. Villanueva's report was released in May of last year, and we have been actively working on that 5-year strategic plan. This report was just released. So, of course, in reference to doing any continued work with Ms. James or the groundwater analysis does require us to go back and do a contract. But we have put our cadet instructors through excellence in training workshops. We have put them through beyond diversity training. Leadership has gone through undoing racism. So we have been doing things in the DEI arena. We've also just recently received a report from the community panel on doing 7 months worth of work on just videos in a DEI lens. So we have constantly been working towards moving the academy forward. But any institution of higher learning is a continuous process. It's not like a one and done. So we are constantly working to improve the academy.
And if I might just add to that, I believe that in our report and at the request of the Office of Equity, that we have presented a framework out of which to work, so that it's like it's not a lot of different things, but it operates under one framework, and that's one of the recommendations. And it doesn't have to be our framework. A framework. Somebody's doing this and someone else is doing this, and that people are confused. And I think that's been part of the problem that we've seen in our findings, is that there needs to be a common framework out of which everyone is operating, clear and concise about what people need to really begin to work to undo racism. And I like to praise the chief and the assistant chiefs for their response analysis workshop that we did, and to tell you that they came out with some strategies in a session that we did following the workshop. And so they too came out with a list of strategies that very much mirror the quick wins that we came up with. All of those are defined within that model and that framework that we have put forward. And so we think that that's the best opportunity to begin to realize some change, as we haven't seen the kind of change that I believe the leadership wants to see, because we haven't had a framework that operates in a way that moves.
I have another question. The top recommendation is to widely circulate this report within the agency, to open up the internal communication lines, acknowledging mistakes and making a commitment. Has that been done internal to APD, Chief K?
The report itself has gone out. We are currently trying to set up listening sessions to talk to different groups, such as TPOA and others, in reference to the associations. We held 4 meetings with the TPOA, which is the African American Association. We actually learned a lot out of those meetings, and actually have several action items that we are working towards to address those things that we learned in those meetings. So we are getting feedback from our employees, and we are actively trying to follow up on those recommendations that they're making.
Mm-hmm. The recommendation was made in the vein of us supporting the leadership in messaging this. We have not been trained to lead conversations on racism, nor have we been trained to lead work, to just be able to do it. And so our recommendations were actually based on continuing to support the leadership, to message this in the right way throughout the organization, and to support them in messaging it in unity. Otherwise, it's like it becomes fragmented when people who mean well go out and want to do it on their own, but without the support, then you don't get the outcomes that you want. And so again, be it us or some other expert around racial equity, to be support, so that this time commitments are made, we may see the data begin to change.
Great. We've got about 4 more minutes. Do we have any other questions from the commission?
We share with you in those 4 minutes just a few of the comments from the workshop.
Absolutely.
You can advance the slides to what page, Wendy? You can advance the slides to
21.
Page 21. Now, those are the recommendations. I want some of their responses to the workshop. Keep going. Keep going.
33.
Page 33. Yeah, right there. That's good. Go ahead, Wendy. You can share those.
Go back one slide. There are a couple on the previous slide that I think would be important for you to hear. Again, these are excerpted from the full report, part of Appendix C. And you can see that some of the feedback we heard about why undo helped us to understand how the team was thinking very deeply about getting to the root cause, understanding it better. Maybe I had blinders on, but I didn't feel like I was working in a racist organization. Hearing comments over the last 12 months have been disheartening. That they came in vulnerable, willing to have conversations about race. The next slide, I'll just move through these quickly, Joyce, in case there's something you want to close with. It's our responsibility to carry out policies and procedures that are fair to everyone. I've seen people's self-esteem and careers ruined because of racism. So there is some awareness of it, even if we didn't see it in total numbers in the survey. If we could go through another slide or two. We asked them to kind of help us to understand better, what aspects of this process was most helpful for them. Not just in the daily life, but or the work experience. And you can just see the range of feedback that we got. And let me just say, this is feedback that we got at the end of the training. And we do this immediately at the end of the training so that we can capture that experience, not tainted by, maybe discussion, outside the realm of the space that we create. Understanding and dismantling systemic racism, understanding the role of systems and outcomes, and looking with a new lens. There clearly wasn't this kind of intuitive knowledge about institutional and structural racism and how it manifests in systems. And we really saw people grasp that understanding to move beyond individual acts of meanness and bias and bigotry to begin to think at a systems level. So what is it that the system was doing and creating that was creating the outcomes that they saw? The next slide. Joyce, these were those priorities and opportunities and measurable actions that we pulled from their feedback in the evaluation, where they talked about wanting to develop and deliver a consistent message. Someone talked about it being at the front door, that when people enter APD, they need to hear the message about creating this organizational culture. They thought that there needed to be this thorough analysis of data to ensure the focus was on the most appropriate areas. They talked about cadets, both the cadets and those who have been in the department for years. Ensure policing is handled by the least intrusive means. So very deep thinking here. They talked about engaging community members and making sure that there was anti-racism language in the APD core values and principles to help strengthen the mission and vision statement.
And these were their thoughts in a strategy session. They were very open and vulnerable and willing, and it was really amazing. But our experience tells us that this is not sustained without ongoing leadership development, to continue to build the capacity to have the lens and the consciousness to see racism and to put the right strategies in place to address them. But there was an openness and a readiness and an eagerness, and they came up with these ideas.
Fantastic. Well, I hate to stop this conversation because I could literally we could talk about this for the whole meeting, probably for the next 6 months. But Thank you so much, Ms. James, Dr. Baumann, Ms. Hill. Thank you so much for joining us again and giving us an opportunity to ask more questions. This is not something we're going to let fall by the wayside. We will continue to follow up. Thank you so much for your time. We truly appreciate it. Thank you so much. All right, moving on to our next business, we have our follow-up action item that we had to table last time on the racial profiling report. We have a recommendation from Commissioner Bernhardt. Commissioner, do you want to take a second to go over what you sent us and what we've posted via email on your recommendation that you have drafted?
Sure. Let me take a quick look at it on my multiple screens, which is confusing me. So what it basically says is that APD has been collecting racial profiling data since 2001. Throughout that whole time, the data has consistently shown that Black and African-American drivers in Austin are significantly more likely to be searched by APD at a vehicle stop than white and Caucasian drivers, and significantly more likely to be arrested. The 2019 data in particular shows that Black African-American drivers are 3 times more likely to be searched and approximately 3 times more likely to be arrested than white Caucasian drivers. And that it also specifically points out that 58% of the total searches of Black and African-American drivers were high discretion searches, which means that the police didn't have to do those searches. And in comparison of the total searches of white and Caucasian drivers, 34% were high discretion searches. And it was a very much smaller amount of the total searches, or of actually Caucasians were just searched a lot less in general, like the numbers are just a lot smaller.
Gotcha.
So the basic recommendation is that the police stop referring cases if they do a high discretion search, that they just don't refer it to the district attorney. But then the recommendation goes on, and I don't know if folks think this is silly, but to basically define high discretion searches to include consent searches and searches conducted because an officer basically smelled something suspicious. Because we've decriminalized marijuana, or we're not arresting people for small amounts of marijuana in Austin, so it doesn't make sense to do a search based on something smelling like marijuana. And then secondarily, officers just stop making high discretion searches in the city of Austin. That we're just not going to do that anymore, because they're always searches for small amounts of drugs. That's what those searches are.
So let's open it up for discussion. So we have a possibility to vote on the recommendation that Commissioner Bernhardt has in front of us. It's been seconded by Commissioner Weber. I'd like to open it up to discussion. Questions? Commissioner Sierra Arevalo, please.
I wanted to get some clarification on how high discretion search is being defined within the context of the APD stop data. Based off of the last meeting, I believe there was some clarification from Chief Gay that high discretion was not exclusively these reasonable suspicion style searches that I believe Commissioner Bernhardt is referring to. It in fact includes consent searches. It might even include plain view searches. So the characterization here that high discretion searches are searches which, quote, that officers didn't have to do,
right,
it doesn't sound accurate. And I would like clarification from someone who knows the formal definition of high discretion search.
And maybe Chief Gay can help here. My understanding is that for the data that the Office of Police Oversight collected, they used a definition of high discretion searches that the police don't use. And that definition included plain view searches in high discretion searches. The police don't consider plain view searches to be high discretion searches. I think if the police see something in plain view, they're going to take account of it in every case. That's not a situation where they exercise a lot of discretion. If I'm misunderstanding that, then Chief Gay should definitely speak. But anyway.
No, I think you have it. That was pretty correct. I do have Dr. Kringen on the line in case anyone wants to get his take. He actually worked with OPO in the Innovations Office on the particular report and can provide additional information if anyone has it.
So this is Jonathan, Dr. Kringen. As far as the OPO report goes, they use two different categorizations. They use a categorization called low discretion and high discretion. That characterization has come out of the sort of academic literature on policing, and yet there is no consensus agreement as to what is low and high search and high discretion. And in fact, in differing jurisdictions, these categories would be different. They would actually fall into different high or low based upon state law, based upon local ordinances and policies and procedures. The rationale that was used by the authors of the report was adopting a series of definitions that were used by the Urban Institute. And they are problematic in that high discretion in this report includes probable cause, it includes consent, it includes plain view evidence and frisk for safety. And so there are elements in that are problematic. In particular, I did work with legal on this a little bit about whether or not under state law plain view is or is not discretionary, and the conclusion of the legal is that it is absolutely not. That the governing legality of it is guided by a statement that says an officer shall, not that an officer may. And so that particular category is absolutely not high discretion. The frisk for safety is, which is included in this to generate these ratios, is a different matter because a frisk for safety or a Terry is fundamentally different than a search for evidence. And so we've done some internal analysis to try to understand, and there are ways to get at whether or not frisks for safety are actually being done in a way that might cause for concern that they're being misused. And so we have done some internal analysis on that, and we are working further with that. The other two categories there are consent and probable cause. And so consent is important to understand in the Austin context. About 10 years ago, you would have 700 to 800 consent searches per year in the 2000 to 2010 category. And consistently over the last 10 years, this number has gone down yearly. And so as reported in a version of the report that the police department had produced starting in about 2014, this starts to go down to about 400. I can tell you that by these data, there are only 30 actual consent searches in this entire data set. So there are some challenges here with aggregating categories together. There are some challenges with in this report about presenting percentages without thinking about base rates. And then Chief Gay could speak to this, is that there's actually a procedure in place with consent searches to provide a substantial amount of default to not conducting the search, right? And so it's actually challenging for an officer to in APD to engage in a consent search. So the other categories that you have there left is probable cause. It's not reasonable suspicion as a legal standard. It's probable cause. And so we can revisit the different levels of legal justification for searches. Probable cause is the higher standard. So that's something that you'd want to think about as well. So at a minimum, I would recommend if you want to pursue the idea that there should be some category of things that might not be referred to district attorney, I would absolutely advise against the idea of using high and low discretion categories. I also think that if you wanted to do that, I think that additional analysis would really be important in that beginning to understand not just the legal justification for the search, but what is it actually resulting in? So generally speaking, when this is looked at from analysis to support a legal understanding, what you look at is actually what are the rates, but what are the rates of, it's referred to in legal doctrine as productivity. But what is it actually that is being found via these searches, and at what rate is there finding? Generally speaking, searches are not considered legally to be an indicator, or they're not to be biased against any particular group if the rates between groups are different, if the rates of finding of evidence, and particularly we might be talking about things here like weapons and whatnot. We're looking into that in very substantial detail, since that's obviously a very important category. When those rates are settled, and we've worked through the we've worked through the same data that we need to report here, so that we can understand and report on what are these things, what are they finding, and at what rates. And we do see, although we see substantial differences in the percent of stops that are probable cause, we look at the actual stops that would result in arrests versus stops that would result in findings of certain kinds of evidence, and we see those to be much more balanced.
Right.
So we don't see substantial differences in terms of a probable cause search resulting in an arrest. In fact, the highest likelihood of a probable cause search likely resulting in an arrest is among white motorists, which are arrested based upon probable cause searches about 64%. When we look at Black and Hispanic motorists, 54 to 56%, and Asian motorists.
Dr. Kringan, thank you for all that information, but this is not something that's in front of us, so you're putting a lot of things in front of us that we have not been able to see and look at, and seems counterintuitive and counterproductive to what we've gotten from the OPO, so we need to stay focused and make sure that we have the right information and that we're putting them into our recommendations. Commissioner Sierra Arevalo, I know you have another follow-up, and we're running short on time, so.
I know. Yeah. Thank you. So this brings me to what I was actually concerned about with the language that was put forth in the recommendation. My assumption is, and it has been confirmed, that these categories of high and low discretion are overly broad. And I believe the language was that all contraband, any contraband that was found, would not be recommended to the district attorney. I'm not sure of the proper protocol here. If the goal is to keep in line with recent changes in Austin law and practice to not criminalize the possession of small amounts of narcotics, such as marijuana, small amounts of other kinds of narcotics, and I think the recommendation should have the language edited to specifically be about narcotics, to be about these things. Currently, I believe it to be a very overly broad recommendation. As far as I can tell, it would mean that any contraband, whether that be weapons, whether that be large amounts of narcotics of various kinds, would also be included in charges that would not be recommended to the DA. I don't think that is the intention. That would be a recommendation that I would put forward to the commission.
Commissioner Bernhardt, how do you feel about that edit to the recommendation?
I mean, I'm not sure. I think that in reality, in both consent searches and probable cause searches that are triggered by smelling something funky in the car, the vast majority of the contraband is narcotics. I think you're right that occasionally we're going to talk about a consent search that comes up with an illegal weapon. I'm not really that concerned about it. My motivation was basically to create an incentive for the police to stop racial profiling. That if they could behave and not racially profile, then they get their power to search back. Because since 2001, I mean, we have a 20-year record of the police department targeting African Americans at a rate 3 times the Caucasian population, and nothing has changed. And I'm willing to let a handful of cases go because the police are not behaving appropriately, and there should be some accountability. If to get this proposal passed, we need to narrow it, I'm okay with that, because I think the police really care about arresting people for small amounts of narcotics, even though it's ridiculous and does not serve a public safety purpose.
So so we can put it back on the table unless there's any other discussion.
I don't know where other folks are at. They feel strongly about the gun issue.
Yeah, that's what I would love to get in front. If someone feels strongly, if someone has questions, Commissioner Hasselflack, go for it.
I'll just make a comment real quick. I mean, I get where Commissioner Bernhardt is going with this about, laying this out to get the point across. I also worry a little bit that, so here, the other side where if this is so general, will it even have any effect? If we send something this general to council, it may just go right, through their hands and they may not do anything. And so I'm kind of on the fence here on it, but I just want to throw that out there that maybe by making it more specific, it would stick well, even though I understand that the bigger point is made by keeping it general. So anybody else have comments, let me know.
Quick pause. I'll give him time back. There she is. Commissioner Weber had dialed in. Thank you guys for bringing her on. Wonderful. Commissioner Ramirez, you had something else.
I totally support the spirit of trying to figure out how to match there needs to be more equity with regards to racial profiling. Like, it needs to go away before we can start. So I get the spirit of it, but definitely the language is feeling a little broad, and I myself don't feel equipped to parse the language right at the second.
You're muted.
We can't hear Rebecca.
Sorry about that. We can vote to, if Commissioner Bernhardt and Commissioner Weber, who are the authors of this resolution recommendation, if they agree, we can agree to get them to, with those narrowing down, and then we can vote on that, I believe, is what I'm, and if you don't support it, even with the limitations, you don't have to vote for it, obviously. All right. Any other questions, comments, discussion before we take a vote? All right. We are opening the vote for the recommendation from Commissioner Bernhardt and Weber. I apologize, did you agree to narrow the language, Commissioner Bernhardt? Yes. You're on mute, I'm sorry.
Sorry. We can narrow the language to searches that result in contraband that is narcotics.
Okay, so the language will be edited to say searches that result in contraband that is a narcotic.
Is that, should we limit, is that okay with everybody?
So the clarification was that is the outcome. So those charges will not be referred to the DA, I believe is what's happening. That means that I think the language can stay about this the dicey reasonable suspicion about smelling is all well and good. I completely agree. That's one of any number of that officers can say to enable a then legal stop. What is the language around what kind of stops, or sorry, what kinds of searches? If we're keeping with the OPO definition, that high discretion encompasses basically almost every kind of search that you can do. It includes probable cause, consent, plain view, and Terry frisks. That would effectively take away any ability for police to do any kind of investigatory search. So if there's something about specifically doing away with the smells, I have no issue at all with that. That seems very specific and doable. I'm not sure what the specificity is that's required to not make which do away with effectively almost all kinds of searches.
So it has a definition in the recommendation, and the definition in the recommendation is consent searches and searches conducted because the officer smells marijuana or smells something suspicious. So it attempts to sort of create its own definition.
Understood. Thank you.
Okay, so the definition of high discretion is in the recommendation, and we will, Commissioner Bernhardt agrees to say searches where contraband, that is a narcotic specifically. Okay, if we are in agreement, we will take a vote on that. So we will start with Commissioner Sierra Aravallo.
I vote yes.
Commissioner Lane. Yes. Commissioner Nunez.
Yes.
Commissioner Ramirez.
Yes.
Commissioner Hassenfluck.
Yes.
Commissioner Weber.
Yes.
And myself, Chair Gonzalez, I support yes. It has passed unanimously.
Chair, pardon the interruption. Commissioner Weber is not eligible to vote today. She signed in as participant because she wasn't able to join the meeting after 30 minutes. So she's participating, but not as a commissioner right now.
Got it. All right, the motion still passes for the recommendation. And Commissioner Bernhardt and Weber, if you guys could work on the updated language and get that sent back out to us, that would be fantastic. Thank you.